Thank you very much, Ernesto. And I only wish I could be in Santiago with at the central bank. It would be very pleasant, like every time I was able to come. But thanks for the invitation. Remind me until when I should be going. I must admit I'm not remembering right now. Is it an hour and 20 minutes or so? Or
I mean, whatever you like. It's 10 minutes, 20 minutes.
okay,
Anything above 5 minutes is going to be okay.
okay. Okay, so this is joint work with Shebnem Kalemli-Ozkan at the IMF and University of Maryland, as well as Veronica Pentsiakova at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and Nick Sender. Nick is a former student of mine who is now on his way to the Bank of Canada. And because my co-authors have affiliations with places that make important decisions in the world, that's why the paper is not really circulated yet. It needs to get through various authorizations, and the views of the authors don't represent the views of the institutions. Okay, so what we are trying to do, if Ernesto, if you could switch to the next slide, what we are trying to do in this paper is very simple. We all understand that as a consequence of COVID, there's been massive economic shock in many countries, and we're trying to estimate the impact this could have on small and medium enterprises, and in particular on business failures. And we want to do that with using a large firm-level database, and we're going to end up presenting results for 17 countries. Most of these countries are European because this is where a lot of the high-quality data is from, but not only European countries. And we're going to, in order to do this exercise, it's a model-driven exercise, is to model the impact of COVID-19. And we're going to try to do that in a relatively rich and flexible way as a combination of supply, demand, aggregate, and sectoral shocks. And just to give an overview of the results, what we're going to find is that in the absence of interventions, and of course there have been a number of interventions in many countries, but in the absence of interventions, if you put yourself back in, March of 2020, and when COVID really hits with full force, the rest of the world outside China, it's been already hitting China for a few months. And you ask what would be the impact on the survival of small and medium enterprise. And what we estimate is that it would have jumped from about something like 4.5% in a normal year, that's the percentage of businesses who fail, to about 12% or even higher. Now, of course, a number of interventions have happened with a lot of heterogeneity across countries. Discussed that a little bit. And so in the paper, we'll also provide some assessment of how effective some of these interventions may have been. And so we'll look at various policy interventions, some are more or less targeted. And we have the luxury in the model to also look at what is the most efficient interventions if we could implement them, and how much this would cost and how many jobs would be saved by doing it. And we find that targeted policy interventions can actually dramatically lower this amount of business failures, at a cost that is relatively moderate, maybe around 1% of GDP, a little more than that maybe, and saving a large number of jobs. Ernesto, I'm going to ask you to switch to the next slide. And so let me just start by having a very quick overview, of the environment that we're going to be studying. So we know the COVID-19 shock is quite unprecedented. This is not what we have typically in our macro textbooks when we think about the type of shocks that we analyze. It's unprecedented in its complexity and its severity. It's really unlike pretty much everything else we've seen so far. And the policy response in the initial stage, at least in many countries, was to engineer an economic shutdown that was, trying for health reasons. So it was trying to sort of force people to distance from others. And this shutdown and the associated lockdowns had very, potentially important implications on economic activity. And we have to think about how to model that. And we are going to approach this by thinking about a collapse in demand, as well as severe constraints on the supply side. Now, the reason we focus on SMEs in this exercise is that they are particularly vulnerable. These are firms with relatively low cash buffers to start with very often. They have maybe limited access to credit. So even if the shock is temporary and you can anticipate it within 6 months or maybe a year, this will be over, that can put them into a very liquid position, potentially push them into liquidation. And moreover, even though SMEs are typically small, they represent a sizable share of employment and output, around 65% of private sector employment in the European Union and about 54% of gross output. So the distribution has fat tails, but still there is a large mass of small and medium enterprise that matters for overall economic activity. Next slide, please. Now, I won't do justice to all the literature that has been coming out on studying COVID-19. I mean, it's certainly been exploding very, very rapidly in the last 6 months. Some papers are looking at the impact on the labor market. Others are looking at the sectoral responses and the linkages between sectors and networks. Some papers, look at the interaction between demand and supply and reallocation. Others, like our paper, are focused more narrowly on business failure. For instance, there are a couple papers on Italian data that have more detailed data than we have, but they have a sort of a simpler modeling framework, more of an empirical framework for modeling business failure. And then there is a literature on policy responses. What is the optimal lockdown? What is the optimal policy at the sectoral or aggregate level? And so, we are placed with, a plethora of papers. It's really been wonderful to watch all this research activity around this new topic. And we're connected to many of these themes, but I'll highlight also some of the limitations of the exercise that we're doing. You'll see that it's a very simple exercise. I don't want to pretend otherwise. So without any delay, let me sort of move on to the model part. And if you could skip maybe the next slide and the following one, get to slide 5. Yeah, exactly. So let me tell you how we're approaching this. So we are going to be looking at the level of a firm that is in a particular sector, so firm I in a sector S, and that firm, we're going to model it as producing some gross output. That's the YIS you see there on the equation, and it produces that with labor, NIS, with fixed factors, which we can think of at the horizon we're looking at. That could be capital, but any other fixed factor, which we're going to keep constant throughout the exercise, and some intermediate goods, MIS, and it has some sectoral labor augmenting productivity. So sectoral means it doesn't have any I subscript here, so we're going to model productivity, labor augmenting productivity at the sectoral level. And then some firm-specific productivity, ZIS. And so that gives you a production function, which is the first equation you see on this slide. And we're going to specialize this a little bit later on to a Cobb-Douglas specification with capital, fixed factors, labor, and materials. And really the only relevant part of the specification here is that the sum of the exponents on labor and materials, beta and gamma, is less than 1. So that's the supply side, very standard. And then on the demand side, we're going to assume something that is also fairly standard, but quite tractable. So we're going to think of a nested CES demand system. So think about D as sort of aggregate demand. and that's a CES aggregate over some sectoral aggregates, DS, and with some elasticity of substitution across sectors, eta. And then there's this psi s in red in the left part of the equation, in the second equation there. And this psi s is how we're going to introduce sectoral demand shocks. So the impact of COVID, one of the things that COVID is going to do is that it's going to dramatically alter the relative demand for some sectors versus others. Think about, going to the restaurant versus ordering groceries online or things like that. And so that's how this psi s is going to capture that. And then each of these DS, the sectoral demand, is itself an aggregator, CS aggregator, over individual varieties produced by the individual firms I was talking about earlier. And so we're summing them over the mass of firms, and S is the mass of firms producing in sector S, and rho S is the elasticity of substitution between varieties in a given sector. Okay, so we have this nested CES from the firm to the sector to the aggregate. And associated with this demand structure, we can define price indices at the sectoral level and at the aggregate level, and I give them to you in the bottom equation there. And the important thing to note is that these demand shifters, psi s, they show up in the aggregate price index. In other words, if you have movements in these demand factors, that's also going to move the overall price index. Okay, so all of this is fairly standard. Let's move on to the next slide. And the next slide, what I'm showing you there at the top is the demand that is going to result from this demand system for the variety I produced by firm I in sector S, and it will have the usual constant elasticity representation. So you have the demand factor psi s to some to the elasticity of substitution eta between sectors. Then there's a first relative price term, the price of the variety versus the price of the goods in the sector. And then there's another relative price, the price of the sector versus the aggregate price level, and then D is the aggregate demand. Now, in the exercise we're going to do, we are going to assume that prices are sticky, at least in the short term. And actually, when we do the exercise, we're going to keep them sticky for the year. But think of them as being sticky and not adjusting. And if you go back, if you were to go back to the previous slide, you see that if all the price of the individual varieties are constant, then the sectoral price, the PS, yes, thank you, Ernesto, the PS you have at the bottom of the slide here would also be constant. So what it tells you is that the sectoral price and the goods prices, we're going to take them as given. And so all the movements in prices that might happen would be coming from the sectoral demand shock. So if we move forward, to the next slide, then that allows us to express the change in demand between COVID and non-COVID in a particularly simple form. Now this, I put a little red triangle warning sign here on the slide to highlight that this assumption that prices are sticky is convenient, but it's also an assumption that's in part rejected by the data. I mean, we know now that some sectoral prices have been moving quite a bit. The price of some goods have increased quite a lot. The price of other goods have been declining. So certainly there has been some movements in relative prices, and that's something that one may want to take into account in sort of a more refined exercise. But in what we're doing here, we're just going to keep it simple here. The other thing that this is going to imply is that output is going to be demand determined in what we're doing. So we're going to be looking at these firms and we're going to say, well, they can't change their price. Their demand might change because of a variety of reasons. And now, how do they meet that demand? This is the exercise we're going to be concentrating on. Now, the change in demand that a firm I in sector S is going to face, we're going to be able to write it in particularly simple form using something we borrow from the trade literature, which is called the hat algebra, And so the hat here, D hat, is just a ratio of demand in COVID time, which we're going to represent with the prime. So DIS prime is demand, let's say, in a period in which COVID is, we have the COVID shock, and DIS is a pre-COVID period. And because we have this very simple multiplicative expression for the demand at the top, then we can represent this ratio of demands. This is what the algebra measures as the product of basically three things. One is the relative, the demand shock, this psi hat. So this is by how much demand is shifted in sector S outside of COVID into COVID. And then the second term is by how much the aggregate price level has changed. And that, again, is going to be coming from a change in the sectoral demands that move the aggregate price level. And then the last term, this PD hat, this is, if you want, this is sort of the shock to aggregate nominal demand. And so this is something that, of course, is, you know, in a full-blown model is going to be an equilibrium object. It would be whatever happens to aggregate output in nominal terms. If prices are not changing, that's sort of going to be very related to aggregate real output. But in our exercise, we're also going to sort of take that as given. We're going to be looking at from the point of view of the firm, and then take this aggregate change in output as something that is given to us. So this is the other way of saying the same thing, is that this is a partial equilibrium exercise that we're doing. We're not going to be closing it in the way that some of the other papers looking at the impact of networks and input-output structure and reallocation have been doing. So we have a much more modest objective here. Hopefully, in exchange for the simplifications along the way, we get something on the back end in terms of the empirical side, but you'll be the judge. So the special case that is going to be particularly convenient is if the elasticity of substitution is 1 between the different sectors. Eta is that coefficient. So if eta is 1, then you see that the shock to demand at the variety level, D hat IS, that's the last equation on the slide, is just the product of two things. It's the sectoral demand shock, and then it's the aggregate nominal shock. Okay? And that's, most of the results and all of the results I'm going to show you today are for that particular calibration of the model. That's particularly convenient. So, okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So I've given you supply and demand, and now I need to tell you what is the COVID-19 shock, or the combination of shocks that represent COVID-19 in this framework. And we're basically going to have 4 shocks. Okay, so the first shock we're going to have is what we call a labor supply shock. Remember that N is the employment at the firm, NIS is employment with firm I in sector S. And what we're going to say is because of COVID, some firms are going to have to cut down on employment. And so there's going to be a labor supply constraint here, that the maximum employment may be lower than the pre-COVID employment. And we'll, in the hat notation, this can be expressed very simply as the change in labor and hat, the ratio of employment in COVID relative to non-COVID, may have to be less than some limit here, some labor supply constraint that may vary across sectors. So how would you want to think about this? Well, you might think that, for instance, well, first, some essential sectors, so think about, I don't know, electricity production, or some foods, some parts of the food or agricultural industry are not going to face any constraints. So they would be in constraint. X hat would be plus infinity. Other sectors, however, may be forced to send their workers home, and those workers may not be able to work at all from home. They might not be able to commute, and so they will have a fraction of their pre-COVID labor force available to produce goods and services during COVID. And that's what this X hat S is capturing. And this is indexed by S, the sector. We're going to construct the measure of the labor supply shock at the sectoral level using data on, how much face-to-face business a particular sector is conducting, how many workers can work remotely versus how many workers have to work on site. So we're going to build and estimate an empirical counterpart of this XS in different sectors. Then there's going to be a productivity shock. Remember this labor augmenting productivity that was in a production function? We're going to allow for that labor augmenting productivity to change and potentially to decrease during COVID. So what this is capturing is the fact that, well, if you're a firm and you send some of your workers home, your workers may be home and they may be able to telecommute, but they may not be as productive in their telecommuting environment as they were in the firm. In fact, one might argue that this is solving a constraint optimization problem. The unconstrained one was before COVID, where the firm was able to organize the way it wanted. So if it was more productive to have workers telecommute, they would do so. It wasn't doing so. So presumably there is some inefficiency associated with sending workers home. You might also think that even the workers who are on site might be you might have to reorganize the physical space on a plant floor, because you have to keep the workers sufficiently separate. You might have to put screens, all these things may reduce productivity. And so we are taking that into account. Again, we're going to try to calibrate that reduction in productivity at the sectoral level. So these two blue lines, bullet points there, these represent the supply side of the COVID-19 shock. Then on the demand side, I've already discussed the two demand shock that we're introducing. Remember, this change in demand is coming from a sectoral component, that's the XI part, and then an aggregate component, the PD hat, that says the ratio of aggregate nominal expenditures in COVID versus non-COVID. And we're going to calibrate both of those things. So the sectoral demand shock, we're going to calibrate and construct at the sectoral level, again, using information on whether the goods and services are being produced require face-to-face interactions with the customers or not. So think about going to a restaurant versus ordering something online. And the aggregate demand shock, which in a fuller model would be, again, as I mentioned, an equilibrium object that would reflect maybe the fact that you have higher uncertainty, you may have precautionary saving, you may have some forced saving if workers are unable to, households are unable to spend, they're locked at home. All of these reasons, this would add up to some level of aggregate economic activity. We are sort of going to take that as a given. We're going to directly input that in the model. And so what our firm is doing in our environment, a firm is basically trying to cost minimize over labor and material, given these two supply constraints and these two demand shocks. And we're going to do that cost minimization problems. If you want, this is a dual approach. We're going to look at the cost minimization problem. And we're going to solve that cost minimization problem firm by firm in all of the different countries and sectors we're looking at. Okay, so let me move on to the next slide here. And flesh this out a little bit more specifically. So, here's the cost minimization problem of the firm. It's minimizing labor costs and materials over the production function. It has to meet the demand, so it has to meet D prime. And labor may be constrained by this X limit on how many workers you're allowed to keep on the floor or able to produce. And there are going to be two regimes. One regime is when labor is not constrained. I mean, intuitively, what's going on is demand is going to contract, so you want to employ less labor, and you have a constraint on labor supply. Now, which of these two is going to be binding is going to depend on whether the labor supply constraint is very, very tight, or if it's the collapse in demand that is the dominant force. So you have sort of a race between demand and supply at the sectoral level here. And so when labor is not constrained, which means that somehow it's the collapse in demand that matters more to the firm. The firm faces much reduced demand. It may be able to employ fewer workers, but that's really not what matters. It's just not facing much demand. Then we can solve for the materials and the employment and in ratio to the pre-COVID times. That's the hat notation. And we can express that as a function of the shocks in the system. So the the Xi, the PD hat, and the A hat. And because the labor supply constraint is not binding, it's obviously not showing. And when labor is constrained, then that's a situation where maybe you might think of some sectors where they're forced to send workers home, but demand has not been reduced very much. Demand might even have increased because there are some sectors where demand might increase. And the employment will be set at the constraint, so N hat will be X hat, that's the constraint. And then the adjustment will be on the materials, depending on a substitution between materials and labor, so depending on the weights in the production function. And the last equation on the slide is showing you what the solution to that program is. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So then, how do we assess business failures? Well, we're going to have a very simple criterion here. We're going to say that a firm is failing if starting with a certain amount of cash, if we add to that the cash flow we predict the firm is going to earn over the period. So in that case, it could be a week, a month, it could be all of 2020. If that is insufficient to cover financial expenses, then we're going to call that a business failure. Now, it's a very strict criterion. In practice, you would want to define maybe business failure in terms of insolvency, so negative equity or something like that. And here I'm giving you a criterion that's based on liquidity. You're not able to meet your financial expenses. I'm going to come back to that in a slide or two and explain why we think that's a more conservative criterion, and that's also one that is likely to be more relevant for SMEs in many cases. So we can write what the cash flow is going to be. We observe the cash, we observe the financial expenses in the data. So the only thing that we don't observe is the cash flow. That's the model object. That's the thing we construct coming out of the model as a counterfactual. And so we can express this cash flow in difference from the pre-COVID cash flow, so CF prime minus CF. And you see that's just going to be a function of these shocks that we've measured and of the tightness of the labor supply constraint or labor and various other shocks. So that's the first expression, is when labor is not constrained, and the second one is when labor is constrained. So that's how we construct our counterfactual cash flow, and then we stick that in our business failure condition.
Pierre-Olivier?
Yep.
Hi, this is Andres Fernandez. I have a couple of clarifying questions.
Sure.
If I can interrupt you. So on the constraints that you're modeling on the firm size, so just to see if I'm understanding this correctly, you have a constraint on the labor side. So we should think of these as workers not being able to go to work. And then you also have a constraint on the demand side, which is firms' demand basically collapses or evaporates, right? You basically don't have demand for the products you produce.
Exactly.
Okay, so these should be thought of as when you're mapping these to the data, when you're disciplining the model. Do you have data on mandatory confinements of sectors and firms? So do you know, for instance, in a particular sector, how many firms were forced to close?
I'll come to that when I talk about the calibration, but we have data. We're going to sort sectors into what we call essential sectors and non-essential sectors. Essential sectors are basically not going to be constrained on the labor supply side. They're going to be able to operate. These are sectors where you basically tell the workers, you don't have to go home. We need you. You go to work. And so we have a bunch of sectors like that. And then for the non-essential sectors, we're going to construct a measure of this labor supply and this sectoral demand shock based on data that tells us how easy it is for workers in those sectors to work remotely, and how close, how much face-to-face contact the firms in that sector have with customers. And so the idea being that, If you're in a business that you need to have a high face-to-face contact in order to sell your goods, then demand might move away from you in a COVID environment. If instead you're in a business where you don't need to face customers, then demand might not move away from you as much. And so that's sort of the basic idea of how we're going to construct this.
Okay, thank you. Let me now make the second question. Perhaps this is more central. Now, you're not allowing at all any credit, or are you?
So I'm going to give you a sort of in-between answer here. We're going to do two exercises when we get to the results. One exercise is going to take a very strong view. So you write here that in terms of the equation I wrote on this slide, cash flow plus cash is less than financial expenses. You might want to include in cash things like, do you have a credit line? Can you tap into, can you borrow from the bank that would allow you to cover your financial expenses, not declare bankruptcy, and move on. For many SMEs, the issue of credit lines is relatively limited. In many countries, they don't have much in terms of credit lines. But it's clear that access to credit could still happen. And in many countries, for instance, that's the way in which the policy response has been implemented, with loan guarantees, for instance, by telling the banks, look, go out and lend to these guys, and the government will cover the losses if those loans are not repaid. So that facilitated access to credit, in particular for SMEs, with variation across countries. So it's clear that in practice, access to credit is important in this equation. But we're going to do it two ways. One is we're going to do this exercise here, which is sort of a static exercise, but we're going to repeat it every week. And every week, we're going to look at this condition and say, if your cash flow plus cash is less than your financial expenses, then you go under. And so that's sort of a very stringent view where you are not able to smooth any of your cash flow over the calendar year. Then we're going to do another exercise where we say, suppose that we look at the cash flow over the entire year until December 2020, and then look at whether at that point in time you've been able to cover your financial expenses. And so implicitly, this is sort of allowing full smoothing during the calendar year. So it's as if you're extending short-term credit. Okay, I'm going to show you both results. So you can think of one as one with a zero credit, even from week to week, and the other one is there is credit up to, the shock hits in March, so there's credit up to, 9 months. Okay.
Okay, great, thanks. No, I don't want to interrupt you anymore on this point, but perhaps we could talk in the end on about the case of Chile, where we are seeing quite a bit of an increase in credit.
Yes, many countries have had that.
So the question now that we are doing research on is empirically how that has in turn determined the decision of firms, one of which is default or exit rather. But let me not interrupt you more. We can talk later about this.
Let me also add one thing here, which is, this is a very sort of data-driven exercise. We want to sort of build a model so that we can fit in pieces that we observe. One of the things if we had, for instance, if we do the same exercise at a country level and you have access, which you guys at the Banco Central de Chile do, to the credit registry, then you can map sort of some of the cash flow data at the firm level with the credit data. And then you can answer these questions much more narrowly. But for us, with the group of countries we have, and without access to something like credit registry, we had to make very sharp assumptions in terms of the credit availability, because this was not something that we could observe directly.
Sure.
But I'll come back to that later on. Let me move on to the next slide, and and then we'll have a pit stop just to gather any questions about the modeling size. But let me sort of flag important limitations of the exercise so far. There are a number of things that we're doing that are very, very limiting. So first, we've had a discussion about, I've already mentioned, it's a liquidity criterion, it's not insolvency. And so that matters to the extent that you have access to credit markets. That's going to be more the case, though, for larger firms than for smaller firms. And so to some extent, the fact that we're ruling out some credit for the SMEs is maybe less of an issue than if we were doing it for large firms, where clearly market access or access to bank credit is more established. Another reason is that it's very difficult, even if you had, we have balance sheet data, but balance sheet data for SMEs is very much sort of a book value. And so constructing estimates of what your net worth is at market value in a COVID environment, that's a very delicate exercise. And so we didn't want to be pushed in that direction too much. Second big limitation, it's not a truly dynamic exercise. I told you we're going to do things week by week and then maybe look at the end of the year. But there's really no state variable here. When we're fitting the shocks and then the firm is sort of solving a static problem and we're repeating that over time, that's one limitation, obviously. I mean, you may want to adjust on some state variables, whether it's capital or other assets. We're not allowing that. Third, important as well, it's not a general equilibrium exercise. I told you multiple times already, we're fitting sort of what aggregate demand is. We're not solving and adding everything back up to what it would be. And so, any sort of, when we're going to be looking at the effect of particular interventions, policy interventions, you want to think of this as sort of first round effect before any kind of multiplier would kick in if aggregate demand responds to it. So if it's holding aggregate demand constant, okay, that's an important limitation here. Mm-hmm. And the last one is we're also not taking into account, there's a very rich and very interesting literature, and Ernesto has contributed to that looks at input-output matrices and amplification and propagation and all these things. We are not having any of that. I mean, we're looking at the firm's problem is solved in a very, very simple way. That could be brought in, and we have some ideas about how to do that maybe going forward. But again, at that stage, getting simple answers trumped getting more complicated ones. And then the one concern for us is going into this input-output matrix and amplification is the how sensitive the results can be to the particular structure of the network. And if we're not totally confident on how we estimate the network, then there's going to be a lot of imprecision in terms of the results that we're estimating. But all of these are limitations of our exercise, are not problems with some of the other studies that are out there. Okay, let me pause here. If you move on to the next slide, I have sort of the first pit stop here, in case there are any questions that have been bubbling up.
I have one question. It's about point 4. There are two elements about input-output. One is about the shape of the input-output and how shocks will continue transmitted through the network. And another, related but not exactly the same, has to do with the elasticity substitutions that we assume either across different type of input or different type of intermediate input. And in this setup, at least the way that you casted for us here, you are assuming unit elasticity substitution across labor and intermediate input, and also think unit elasticity substitution across different type of intermediate input. So at 4-digit disaggregation, I'm not sure whether that is such a sensible assumption, and I'd like to ask you to speculate a little bit what may be the implication of relaxing that assumption and thinking about complementarity at that level of disaggregation.
Yeah, no, I mean, Ernesto, this is exactly the kind of question that we would want to look into. I mean, we made the assumption that you're absolutely right. So unit elasticity of substitution between labor and materials. I mean, it's a Gauss production function. And then we have unit elasticity of substitution between the different intermediate inputs as well. That's the I mean, we could have an elasticity of substitution that's different from one across varieties within a sector, but across sectors it's one. So these are assumptions that are going to matter tremendously if you wanted to sort of think precisely about the kind of questions that you're interested in, and we're sort of shutting them down. I don't have a good answer to give you in terms of speculation about which way I would want to move these things. I mean, the only thing I can, indicate is I think that there is a lot of, there's a lot of room for very different estimates there, maybe across different sectors, across different countries. And given the nature of the exercise we had, we wanted to keep things as simple as we could. But that's a shortcoming of what we're doing.
So let me give you one example on that. In this model, when there's going to be a restriction on the supply of labor, there's going to be a boom in demand for intermediate inputs.
Yes.
How large that boom is going to be depends on the substitution.
Yes. Yes, and so that's something that empirically we were confronted to. So they were, this is not in the version I'm showing you now, but we've been doing some work, and we have a version that will be ready soon with an update of some of the results we have here. And so there was, let me describe the kind of weird situation you could find with the setup we have. So imagine that you're a firm that faces a demand that doesn't collapse very much, but your labor is shut down, and your workers are sent home. And now, as you described, you're going to have to substitute by using materials. I showed you the equation for what happens to materials. That depends on its beta and gammas. And so you could end up having, in order to meet the demand, you could end up having to spend a fortune on materials just to be producing at that level. And so clearly there's something a little bit weird about that. So, there are various ways of dealing with this. So one of the ways in which we're dealing with it in the revised version we have is to allow firms to mothball, for instance. So if your cash flows, if you have the option, if your cash flows are lower than what you would have by just suspending production and just paying fixed costs for a period, then you'd obviously want to do that. And so we can sort of avoid some of these extreme behaviors by doing that. There are not so many, it's not so much of a factor in what I'm showing you today, but in some of the experimentations we had, some of the updates to the data we had, we realized that there were a few firms that were sort of doing these weird things. And so that's very much related to exactly what you're describing, which is materials and labor are substitutes. And if the shares are such that you need a lot of labor to substitute for a lot of materials to substitute for a little bit of labor, then you're going to have exploding variable costs. There are no more questions? I can maybe move on. Okay. Ernesto, if you could move on to slide 12. There, thank you. So let me now talk a little bit about the calibration. So there were already a few questions about that. So I'm going to very briefly describe what's going on here. So first, on the labor supply, what we're going to be doing is borrow from the work of Jonathan Dingle and Brent Neumann with a recent paper on this, and use the Occupational Information Network survey that looks at the feasibility of remote work by industry. So we're going to construct an index of labor supply by looking at the ability to work remotely. And if you're in the non-essential industry, and if your workers are sent home, and then workers were sent home, if you're able to work remotely according to this index, then you can still basically be working. If you're not able to work remotely, then you're furloughed. And this is something I should have mentioned, but here what we're assuming is that when the workers are furloughed, they're not hitting the cash flow of the firm. So all the exercise we're doing are already looking at the situation where you have a short work time program in place, where the government is already absorbing the wage bill of workers who are not able to work because they've been sent home. So this is not an expense at the firm level. So that's the labor supply. I'm going to show you some numbers in a minute. The productivity, this one is a little bit more of a sort of a wet finger in the wind kind of estimate. We're sort of saying, well, we are going to allow for productivity to be lower if you're working remotely. We have some estimates of the fraction of workers who can work remotely, so we can see how that changes from before COVID to COVID. But if you work remotely, we're going to assume that you're 20% less productive than if you're working on site. That's a bit of a made-up number, but it ends up not being very important in the end. So I'm not going to emphasize it too much. The results are very robust to that. Then on the sectoral demand side, what we're going to be doing is also use this occupational information network survey, and we're going to classify occupations based on reliance on face-to-face interactions. Okay, and so if occupations are going to be highly reliant on face-to-face interactions, if you're working with external customers, if you have physical proximity, if you're assisting in caring for other, so these kinds of professions where you're, the service professions, working with the public, etc. So we're going to build an index at the sectoral level of this this reliance on face-to-face interaction. And then finally, this aggregate demand, this PD hat, this will just feed in country by country from the IMF quarterly growth forecasts from the WEO, from the World Economic Outlook. And so we're taking the June 2020 updated forecast to do that. Now, so COVID in our calibration is going to hit the first week of March. It's going to last for 8 weeks, and then the lockdown period is going to end. And when the lockdown period ends, then these supply shocks are lifted. Workers are able to go back to working, and productivity goes back up. The demand shocks, aggregate demand, is still going to be driven by whatever the estimates from the WEO are for the forthcoming quarters, and then the sectoral demand, we're going to assume that this is reverting back to pre-COVID with some persistence, which is about 0.5 per quarter for the autoregressive coefficient. So there's going to be some persistence on the demand side. The supply shocks are going to be lifted right away. Okay. If you could move on to the next slide, Ernesto.
Yep.
So, yep. Is there a question? No? Okay, so this is showing you the estimates of the sectoral shocks. This is the X hat, so this is the constraint on your labor supply. And this is across, we construct at the sectoral level, so this is showing you across the different sectors we have. And you see that it's, in the food and accommodation industry, this is the largest, it's close to 90%. And there's actually a big decline also in mining, which we were surprised about, but then we looked in more details, and it turns out that there are activities of mining that require close proximity of workers. And maybe it's not so surprising after all. They're sort of crouching in tunnels under the ground, and you can't really do that in the COVID times. Then entertainment and recreation and other services are also hit very, very strongly by this constraint on labor supply. At the other end, you see things like some of the essential sectors, so electricity, water and waste, transport and storage is also not very hit, or construction is also not very hit by the constraints on the labor supply. If we move to the next slide, these are the sectoral demand shocks. Yep, there they are. So these are the Xi hats, so the decline in sectoral demand. And again, this is related to physical proximity to customers. And so you can see that, not surprisingly, entertainment, recreation, food, and accommodation, these are also hit very badly, between negative 60% and 70%. Education is also hit very strongly, much less demand for education. And then some sectors see very little decline in demand. Now, none of this is normalized to sum to one. This is just sectoral demand pre-post-COVID. But you see that the distribution is not coincident with the one for the labor supply shocks. All right, so these are the sectoral inputs. And then what do we do? If you move on to slide 15, we take firm level data from Orbis. So we have data at the firm level for mostly unlisted firms. We're going to look at small and medium enterprise from 17 countries. The data we have is for 2017. That's the latest data that's available. So it's not literally pre-COVID in the sense of being 2019, but unless there is some significant change between 2017 and 2019, individual firms' outcome may be different, but the overall distribution is not going to be terribly different. and you have the list of countries we have. There's a preponderance of European countries. That's just because Orbis, the highest quality countries are most of them in the data quality countries are most of them European countries, but we also have Japan, Korea, and we don't have the US because in the US, Orbis is mostly about listed firms and doesn't have many unlisted ones, so that's not a good sample for us. The SMEs focuses on firms with less than 250 employees, and we cover. I'm going to show you some statistics on coverage. We cover about 70% of the aggregate economy. We have data on sales, on the wage bill, on inputs, on employment, on cash flow. And so these are all the inputs we need in order to construct our counterfactuals. Okay, next slide, please. So this is showing you the coverage for the countries we have in 2017. So this is a coverage in terms of gross. Actually, let me make sure I get this right. This is coverage in terms of OECD revenues. So these are only the OECD countries in our sample, and the gray ones are ones where the data is of slightly lower quality than the other ones. So Germany, Japan, Korea, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the UK. You can see that these are countries where the coverage is also on average lower compared to the others. On the next slide, we do as a sort of a counterfactual, we use our methodology to also construct business failure rates in a non-COVID time, and we compare that to the OECD business failure rates. And what this table is showing you is that, we're not far off in terms of, for some countries, for some other countries we're undershooting quite a bit. The UK, for instance, we're only estimating 3.6% business failures. The data is around 14%. But on average across countries, our business failures in normal times are not too far off from the business failures we observe from OECD data. So that's reasonably reassuring, again, with some variation. And then, if we move on to slide 18, we have you see the coverage in terms of employment share, labor cost, and revenue share and total assets for large firms and SMEs. And so you can see that SMEs represent a fairly sizable part of all of these metrics. And so that's the reason why we focus on them here. Okay, so second pit stop, if you move on to the next slide, Ernesto. If there are any questions on how we do the calibration before I show you the results.
Yes, Pierre-Olivier, I have another question on business failures. You might have already touched upon this, but just to fix ideas, a business failure is you as a firm not ever showing up in Orbis ever again, or is there any legal procedure that is also involved?
No, so so you're asking a question when we do the comparison for the OECD data countries and we do run our non-COVID counterfactual. Is that what you're asking?
Yes. So I understand that you discipline the model with a rate of business failure from the data, right? Which you showed.
No, actually we don't. So I'm just showing you, in fact, that these are not targeted moments. So if we can go back to slide, what slide is that? This is slide 17. Yep, this one. These are all untargeted moments. So I'm showing you here, the right-hand side is what it says Orbis, is if we apply our methodology, which is basically, we call you failed if you have your cash flow and your cash is insufficient to cover your business expenses on an annual basis. These are the numbers we would get outside of COVID. The OECD column is showing you just the numbers that are reported by the OECD and from a database on the business demographic indicators. So this is not based on the Orbis data at all. And so these moments are not targeted. You can see that they vary a lot, just giving you a sense that somehow we're not doing too poorly in terms of matching some of the variation across countries and sort of the orders of magnitude in business failures in normal times. Okay, but we're never looking at whether a firm disappears in Orbis and doesn't come back. I mean, there are a variety of reasons why firms might disappear in Orbis. They might be merging, might be disappearing really, it might just be not reporting. So we're not looking at that.
So this is your looking at Orbis data and applying your definition of failure.
Yes.
This is what the numbers look like. Okay.
Exactly.
This is very important for us because we're currently now struggling with precisely a measurement of that thing,
Yes.
right? That object.
Yes.
Thank you.
So a little bit insistent on that. Your definition of failure is not bankruptcy. It's is liquidity problem for the firm, defined in one particular way. So the bankruptcy law in different countries may make those firms to get terminated or not, depending on the exact content of the law, right?
You are right in principle. However, I think in practice, in the context of COVID, I think the distinction is likely to be very small. So it's true that firm could be illiquid, could enter into some form of restructuring or et cetera, and the bankruptcy law could come in, and maybe the firm would be able to continue. In practice, however, my understanding is first that bankruptcy laws are often, in many countries at least, and that's true for many of the countries in our sample, the European countries, bankruptcy laws are very inefficient or much less efficient than they could be in the US. That's point number one. Point number two is, in the context of a pandemic, you have to somehow assume that the bankruptcy courts would be able to process efficiently a large number of claims and restructure businesses fairly quickly. And we know that's already not the case in normal times. So in COVID times, I think a lot of these businesses would actually be pushed into liquidation. So that's the answer to. I mean, in practice, you're right that in practice, in theory, this could be different, but in practice, I don't think that it makes much of a difference. Okay, if there are no more questions on the second pit stop, let me move to the baseline results. So yes, next slide, exactly. So this is our sort of headline number. When we run our exercises across all countries, I'm going to slice the data in a number of ways. First, you see for the high coverage countries, so these are the countries where we have a higher coverage of employment or revenues for the Orbis data compared to the overall universe of small, medium enterprise. We see an increase in the business failure rate from about 3.6% to about 12.3%, 12.4%. Now, again, remember, this is without any intervention, except maybe the fact that this is only for the annual data. And so this is implicitly assuming that you could roll over any cash flow deficit within a given quarter or given month until the end of the year. It's only at the end of the year that we do the tallying, and we just, we look at whether you cover your financial expenses. Very similar numbers if we look at the overall set of countries, 4.5 to 12, slightly smaller increase, but very significant increase in business failure overall. If we look across countries, so if we move to the next slide, this is showing you the increase in the failure rate. So this is the change from non-COVID to COVID across the different countries. And you see we have a lot of heterogeneity here. A country like Italy, the increase in the business failure rate is closer to 14%. A lot of countries are closer to 9 or 5-6%. And then at the other extreme, Korea, it's an increase that's only about 2%. Okay, so a lot of variation. And that variation is going to reflect first this composition of output, what sectors, so that's obviously going to be important. And then also the health of the businesses, how much cash they have to start with that will allow them, or how much leverage they have, how much debt they have, financial expenses they need to cover. So all of these conditions, both the health of the business sector and the sectoral composition, are going to matter in these outcomes. And in the paper, we provide some, we drill deeper and we sort of contrast what happens in Italy versus, for instance, Germany, and decompose between the composition versus the health of the businesses. If we look across sectors,
can I ask you a very quick question? So I'm a little bit confused because you said that this is without any kind of intervention, but when you introduce the aggregate demand shock, that is done through the wheel of forecasts, right?
yes.
That kind of includes the fiscal packages and everything that was.
Yeah, you're right. So we're feeding in this aggregate demand, which of course the IMF teams in the area departments and in research will have to sort of make their best guess as to what will happen, conditional on everything that happens. But here, so the reason I'm saying this is without any direct intervention is through the lens of the model. So if you think about, so there, in a sense, there are two ways to answer this. One way is we're saying if this was the change in aggregate demand, then this is, and nothing was done, beyond what's happening to aggregate demand, nothing was done for firms. This is what you would see in business failure rates. That's one level of answer. Another one would be if we had no intervention at all, maybe the aggregate demand would have been even worse, and that's what we would have wanted to feed into the model. And then those business failure rates would have been even higher. Okay. So in a sense, these are the fact that we're feeding in the IMF numbers that take into account, of course, some aggregate response is biasing us downwards in terms of the business failures we're going to find.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from the audience, so I'm going to unmute Ricardo.
Yes, Professor, are shocks suffered by firms correlated to the prevalence of COVID-19 across different countries?
We don't, I mean, that's an empirical question one could look at. We haven't looked at that directly. I mean, so if I think about the aggregate demand shocks, I would imagine that there is some degree of correlation with the prevalence. I mean, you would expect stronger lockdown measures to be put in place in some countries compared to others, and that may be related to the prevalence of COVID-19, and that would maybe have an impact, both because of the lockdown measures and maybe because also of endogenous distanciation measures that people start applying to themselves. So I would not be surprised that this is the case, but we haven't empirically tried to verify it, or in a sense, it's a somewhat orthogonal question to what we're looking at.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. So that next slide is doing the same decomposition, but now across sectors. So this is aggregating the sectors in the different countries and weighting them by their GDP shares. And what you see there is which of the sectors are most affected in terms of business failures. And not surprisingly, what you get is business administration is the one that is largest hit, and then entertainment and recreation, education, and these have business failure rates that are upwards of 20% in our baseline scenario, and others on the right side of the diagram are much smaller numbers on average across countries. If we move on to the next, actually, I'm going to skip the next. Let's look at the next slide. Yes, so this slide here is showing you, again, this is showing you the bankruptcy rates for the different sectors. So you can see this is the same information as in the previous figure, but these are sort of essential sectors. You can see that the increase in bankruptcies are relatively moderate. And instead, if you look at non-essential sectors, some of them, if you go to the next slide, some of them are have very, very, very sharp increases. And Ernesto, if you could, yeah, thank you. Some of them are very, very big increases in bankruptcy rates. So our baseline estimates, for instance, a sector like education, 25% of small, medium enterprises would go under. Arts and recreation, 25% compared to 4% in normal times, and the same thing for business administration. So there can be sectoral differences that are quite sizable. I'm going to switch to, I want to make sure I leave enough time, so I want to talk about policy dimensions. So let's switch to slide 25 if we could, and then that's the last slide on the baseline scenario, and then I'll talk about policy dimensions. So what this slide is showing you is if we redo the exercise, and now we're assessing whether a firm has to be liquidated every week. So we're looking at week 1. If the firm cannot meet its business expenses, it's going under. If it can, it moves to week 2. If week 2 it cannot, then it goes under. So this one is sort of like the strictest interpretation that there is no access to credit markets. If in any given week you fail, then you fail. And the gray area is the period of lockdown. On the horizontal axis, you have the weeks since the beginning of 2020. So we lock in week 8 and we go for 8 weeks, and then we reopen. And you see that you have a buildup in business failures, of course, during the lockdown. It can be pretty sharp, but then it continues also after the lockdown, because some businesses are in fairly weak and fairly precarious situation. And even if demand is coming back up, and even if supply constraints have been lifted, they actually can still be going under. And so we have a pretty sizable increase in the bankruptcy rates. They're actually about only 2% above the ones we have when we do the assessment over the entire year. So another way of saying the same thing is that allowing firms to smooth cash flow over the year helps, but it doesn't dramatically change the picture in terms of overall bankruptcy rates. They are elevated either way, and the different lines that correspond to different industries. You can see that arts and entertainment would go all the way to 30% instead of, for instance, 25% that we had in the baseline.
I have a quick clarification question here.
Yeah.
So after the lockdown is lifted, what type of shock is the one that explains the inertia? Should be some inertia in some of the shocks, right?
Yeah, so the demand shocks are reverting slowly to, so first we're fitting the aggregate demand from the WEO going forward. So we're lifting things in terms of the lockdown, but we're still feeding the WEO estimate. So if there is any sort of estimate that there is going to be a persistent effect of this that's baked into the WEO estimate, that's going to be there. Then the sectoral shocks are going to be reverting back to normal at a speed of, with the autocorrelation coefficient of 0.5. So that's going to on a quarterly frequency. So that's going to half of the shock goes away every quarter. So that's going to dissipate pretty quickly, but still there's going to be some remnant effect. And so you still have some firms there that have been able to survive a big part of the lockdown, but they may still be in a situation where they're going back to the point we were making earlier. The demand may still be fairly weak. They are not earning a lot of cash flow, and they've been bleeding cash. Maybe they started with a strong cash position. They've been running down their cash, and they're hitting their business failure constraint further down in the lockdown.
What about the loss of productivity due to the teleworking?
We're lifting that right away. So both the constraint on labor supply and productivity are coming back up. We're assuming workers are able to come back. They're able to be as productive as before, which is maybe a little bit of an extreme view, but so that's not coming from that. It's not because the firms are still less productive or because the workers are not able to come back. Okay, so it's really coming from the fact that the firms are still in a situation where they're facing depressed demand and they're running down cash. They're bleeding cash flow. Okay, so you can imagine that the restaurant maybe had some cash that would allow it to cover 3 months of expenses. and then it comes back, but the demand is still not there, and they're still running down their cash. Okay, and at some point they run out. Okay, so let me walk you through. Let me move to slide 27, and I want to show you a few scenarios for policy dimensions. That's the next slide. Thank you. So first, we're going to do an all firms bailout. So in our, in our model, we know exactly how much each firm needs in order to avoid hitting that liquidity business failure constraint. So suppose that we're omniscient, we are the planner, we have all the information, we could come in and we can see what every firm needs, and we give that exactly what it needs to every firm, then we can bail out all the firms in the economy. So each SMEs receive just enough cash to avoid bankruptcy. We could do a targeted bailout, which is slightly different. We could say, oh, wait a minute. There are some firms out there that would have failed even without COVID. So we don't want to bail those out. Those are sort of like the bad firms to bail out. So we only want to bail out the ones that would go bankrupt because of COVID. Okay, so then we target is exactly the firms that are hit by COVID and failed because of COVID. So these are, of course, not policy interventions that are available to the policymaker in general, but at least we can run them and we can see how much they would cost and how many jobs would be saved, and we can look at various metrics. Then in terms of policies that could actually be implemented, we're going to look at two of them. One is an interest cost subsidy. What if the governments were to say, we're going to cover your financial expenses, your annual financial expenses, we're going to cover that. So how much of a difference would that make? And then the other one is a blanket subsidy where we say the following. We say, we look at your wage bill in pre-COVID times. So we look at your wage bill in 2019, or in our case, 2017. And we're going to give you a subsidy that's proportional to that. So firms that employ more workers are going to get a bigger subsidy than smaller firms that have fewer workers, okay? And so, for instance, the subsidy could be, we're going to cover 100% of your wage bill during the 8 weeks of the lockdown. And so that would be covering 8 over 52 of your annual labor cost, okay? Now notice one thing, this is not an employment subsidy. This is not tied to employment in COVID. This is a lump sum. It's just that the size of the lump is tied to the size of the firm prior to COVID, okay? So this is not something that's going to induce firms to want to hire workers. This is something that is independent of what they're doing with their workers today. It's just a lump sum, okay? And we can vary that. So if we move to the next slide, I can show you a few metrics here. So first, let's scroll down one more slide. Thank you. So here, this is the targeted bailout. So this is sort of like the ideal policy. If you're the policymaker, if you could implement that, you would do that. What this is doing, you're bailing out all the firms that failed because of COVID. So you're reducing the bankruptcy rate, from whatever it was, 12-something% to 3-something. So you're reducing it by 8.75%. You're eliminating all of the bankruptcies that are due to COVID. You're only left with the ones that are, would have been there otherwise. You're saving about 5.25% of the labor force. And you're saving about 1.60% of GDP, okay? And then the fiscal cost here is 1.1% of GDP. So it's a fairly small fiscal cost if you could implement that policy. It sounds like it has a fairly high, what we call a fiscal bankruptcy multiplier. It's not a multiplier in the Keynesian sense of the world, which has to do with aggregate demand and all those things. Here, this is all shut down. Aggregate demand is held constant here. That's a question that we asked a couple times before. This is just saying, if I could deploy this on impact, for every dollar I spend, I save about $1.45 in wage bill. So this is even before any multiplier in the traditional sense comes in. So this is, of course, this looks very, very interesting. But, it has this slight defect that, of course, it's impossible to implement something like that. It requires an amount of information that we don't have. So what if we do some other things? So let's move down to the next slide. The interest costs waived, that actually turns out to have almost zero effect. So it reduces the bankruptcy rate by 0.3%. It costs almost nothing. It's 11 basis points of GDP. but it saves almost nothing. It's only about, the same order of magnitude, 0.12% of jobs and 0.04% of GDP in wage bill. So this is something that is largely ineffective. I mean, this is one pipe that is right there. You could say, look, we're going to waive your interest expenses during the year. But this is really, a lot of these firms is not going to make a difference. They are not getting in trouble because they have high financial expenses. They're getting in trouble because their cash flow just collapses and they have very little cash. Okay, so we can look at the next slide, and the next slide is saying, well, what if we do this policy I described? Would you get 100% wage cost covered for 8 weeks based on the prior year? Okay, so that's a lump sum. And that actually has a sizable effect. You bring down the bankruptcy rate from 12% to 8%, so 4% reduction. It is much less targeted. So if you look at the cost, the fiscal cost tends to be much, much bigger. It's about 2.4% of GDP. And the wages saved are only 0.88, so 0.9% of GDP. So in a sense, here, your fiscal bankruptcy multiplier is much, much lower. It's only, you save only about 40 cents of private sector wage bill for every dollar that you spend on this policy. Again, before any multiplier effect. But still, it's telling you that this is something that is not particularly well targeted. And the way we looked at this into the by zooming in the paper, if you move to the next slide, and that's sort of the last result I want to show you, and scroll down one more, please. Right. So what this is doing, this table here is doing, it's spreading out the firms, and and puts them into 3 buckets. The first bucket is what we call the survivor firms. So these are firms that would survive with or without COVID. COVID is bad, but these firms are relatively strong and are going to be able to make it. Okay, and they will make it without any assistance, and they will make it, of course, even more if they get financial assistance. The middle group, ghost firms, these are firms that would fail even if COVID wasn't there. So it's somehow, these are firms you don't want to target. You'd rather let them go. I mean, there's a sense these are like zombies there's a close affinity between those firms and the zombies in literature. These are firms that, are not able to survive even without COVID. So why would you help them anyway? And then the third group are the ones that you would like to target. These are what we call the viable firms. They're the ones who would survive without COVID, but they fail under COVID. Okay, now if you scroll down one more slide, if you look at this 8-week 100% labor subsidy that we're looking at, so this is, again, just a lump sum to the firms. The big problem this has, and that's the reason why this fiscal bankruptcy multiplier is relatively low. If you look at the first panel, the first 3 columns, you see that about 2% out of the 2.4% that this policy costs, 2% goes to firms that don't need it. It goes to firms that are survivors. They would have survived anyway. And only about 0.3%, so almost like a tenth of this, a little bit less than a tenth, goes to firms that are actually the target, the intended target. So in a sense, this sort of blanket subsidies to firms, it's good because it covers the ones that need it, but it's bad because it ends up going in a pocket of a lot of firms that don't really need it. And so what this suggests when you're thinking about policy in an environment like this is you have a trade-off between targeting and efficiency. Something that is very targeted, like business expenses or interest expenses, that's not going to be doing much because the pipe is just too narrow. If you want things that are more blanket, then it's going to be much more costly, and it's going to go in places where it doesn't need to be. And so the question then becomes, well, is there a way in which you can reclaim some of that, claw back some of the help later on? Now, this, not surprisingly, what this starts looking like is some sort of equity injection. Now, in a sense, what you would want to do is you'd want to provide some, some support to firms, and then get some claim on future profits. If the firms were survivors, then that means you're diluting some of these existing owners, but that means you're going to reclaim whatever you provided to the firm. If the firm is actually going to fail, then you're losing it, but that's sort of, that comes with the territory. And if the firm survives because of that, then you may not be reclaiming as much of it, but at least you've been supporting those firms. So some form of equity injection is what you're sort of looking at as in terms of the ideal instrument. And that doesn't really exist. I mean, it's very hard to imagine the government coming and taking an equity position in small, medium enterprise. And so there are ways in which you can replicate that maybe with some sort of fiscal support upfront, combined with some sort of clawback or excess profit tax on the back end. And excess profit tax is like a dividend that's being distributed back to the government. And so these are the directions in which there might be a way to limit the misallocation of these kinds of policies. And what we found is that very often you get this trade-off between how effective they're going to be and how costly they're going to be. Okay, so that sort of is my last slide. There's a conclusion slide, but it's already 2:25, so it's just summarizing what I've discussed with you. I'd rather open it up to the floor.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Olivier. So if you have a question, please tell us so in the Q&A section, and we will open the mic for you.
So yes, this is Andres again. I know this is not in your model, but would you care to reflect upon whether these subsidies? So let me think. So would you prefer giving subsidies rather than loan guarantees? If you were to choose, would you let the financial system in the allocation of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that gets into a question about how quickly and efficiently the banking system can step in, and that may vary quite a bit across countries. So I think, one of the issues, for instance, in the U.S., is that it's unclear whether the PPP loans, which is equivalent of the loan guarantees you're mentioning, have been dispersed sufficiently aggressively and have been reaching, especially to the small and medium enterprise. I mean, there's going to be a tendency for the banking sector to sort of minimize the exposure, and at the same time, the loan guarantees cannot be 100% because that would create other problems. So the question is, how quickly and efficiently can the banking sector provide relief to the business sector through that channel? And I think that it's not a question that has a uniform answer. I think it really depends on, some countries have more developed banking sectors than others, are more banked, the firms are more banked than others. Some countries, the banks may be in better health than others, and so they may be willing to sort of step in more quickly. And so I think there's not a uniform answer to that. The advantage of doing some sort of direct transfer is that the pipes are there. I mean, you can do it through various channels. You can do it through either corporate income tax, or you can do it through any kind of payroll taxes if you want something that is assessed on employment, that can reach the firms fairly quickly, because as long as the firms, I mean, there's an issue in many countries about businesses that are going to be incorporated and going to be fiscal accounts versus others that are going to be underground. But at least for all the activity that is, but that's going to be, to some extent, it's going to also be a problem for loan guarantees. At least I think that potentially you can distribute resources more efficiently with the latter way. But as I said, you're going to have a lot less control. It's going to be a much cruder instrument. You're not going to have the granularity that you could have with loan guarantees, where firms are turning to banks where they may have a banking relationship. They are relatively well known. So there's a lot of information that can go into that in terms of sorting the firms in between the survivors, the viables, and the ghosts. And the blanket policies are not going to be able to do that.
Yes, no, I would agree with this assessment. I would only add that the more you're thinking about emerging markets here, I know it's not your focus, but the more you're thinking about emerging markets, the more you start having the fiscal constraints involved, no? And that can be an issue.
Absolutely. Well, no, so yeah, that's an issue in the background, regardless of how you do it. I think the loan guarantees doesn't get you out of the fiscal constraint necessarily. I mean, you have to be willing to absorb some losses, and so that sort of engages your fiscal capacity.
Sure, absolutely, I agree as well.
So, any more questions? In the meantime, you make up your mind. I'm going to ask a question myself. It's about small firms and big firms. So you answered before that liquidity crisis for a firm is very highly correlated with bankruptcy for COVID for small and medium firms. What about big firms? Whether the conclusions here should be extended to big firms, and if not, what is the limit to get considered a firm big or small?
Well, we apply a very arbitrary criterion, which is the one that often is used to classify this firm, which is based on employment size. So 250 employees and less is our definition. But of course, this is arbitrary, and 249 versus 251 don't make much of a difference. Now, I think the view is that if you're a larger firm, and I think there is evidence to document that, you have much more ability to smooth shocks of that nature. Whether because you can have an existing credit line, because you can obtain a loan on relatively short notice, because you can tap the bond market. You could even imagine, if you're a listed firm, issuing equity or bringing in outside investors, even if you're an unlisted firm. So I think that criterion we're using would be, if I understand your question right, that criterion we're using would not be adequate. And then on top of that, as you started with the liquidity versus bankruptcy, I would imagine that restructuring proceedings for larger firms is something that, because there are, especially if you're a listed firm, there are published, there are regulatory filings, there are estimates of your assets and liabilities. There's a whole body of information about how to go about a restructuring that you don't have in the context of small and medium-sized enterprises. So I think for all these reasons, the criterion we're choosing to look at I would not feel very comfortable applying that to larger firms. But whether it's 250, 500, 1,000, or that I think is a muddier issue.
So, any more questions? Okay, so probably we should end up the webinar now. We want to thank Pierre-Olivier for kindly accepting to present this paper to us today. And we hope to see you all next week at a regular time, 11:30 a.m. Chile time, with a new webinar. Stay tuned.
Thank you for having me.